In this video, we're going to look at what a variable is. So if you know what a variable is, just skip this video and go to the next one. We're also going to look at what access modifiers are. So I'm going to just delete my print hello world statement from the last video, and I'm going to create up here something called a comment, which starts with 2 backslashes for a 1-line comment, and I'm just going to say these are my variables, right? And what a comment is just a line that the computer won't read and execute. So whenever it sees these 2 backslashes, it'll ignore everything else on that line. So these are just used so programmers can organize their code and so that we understand what a certain block of code is used for. So for example, when you create a new script, you already have a comment here saying that the start is used for initialization and then the update is called once per frame. So I'm going to create a variable, and what a variable is if we look at the Wikipedia definition of a variable, it just says that it's a storage location paired with an associated symbol name or an identifier which contains some known or unknown quantity of information referred to as a value. And then the variable name is used to reference the stored value. But what that means in simple terms is that a variable is just a name, right? So for example, I can say that my name, Wilbur, is a variable for me, right? So at one point in time, say I was, I don't know, 3 years old, and my favorite game was Super Mario, right? And now I'm 28 years old, and my favorite game is probably The Witcher 3 still. So even though I've changed over time, right, my name Wilbur still refers to me. So that's essentially what a variable is. So you create variables for things like health, speed, all those type of things, and then you store values in there, and then you can update those values or refer and compare those values. So to create a variable, I have to first type in what's called its data type, right? And in some programming languages, you can just use, something like that. Like in JavaScript, you'll just say var, and then you choose a name. But in C#, you have to, well, you don't have to, but it's considered good practice to actually use the type of data that you'll be using. And there are many types of data that you can use. The ones that you should remember as a beginner are the int, the bool, the string, and the float data type. Those are by far the most common ones, right? So let's start with an integer. An integer starts with int, and an integer in maths is simply a non-decimal point number. So it's like a whole number, and it can be positive or negative. So after you type in the data type like int, you then have to give it a name, and the name must start with a letter, and the name can contain letters, numbers, or underscores. So usually you want the name to refer or to be associated with the type of data that you're going to be storing. So for example, because this is my player controller, I'll create one called speed, like that, right? And in programming, you end every statement, which is equivalent to a sentence in normal English, with a semicolon, right? So int speed. This is what you call declaring a variable. So all I'm doing is when the computer comes and runs this code, it says that there's going to be an integer called speed, so it allocates memory for a speed value to be stored later. Or if you want to actually store a value now, after you type in the name, you'll use an equal sign, and then you have to give it a value. So because this is an integer, I have to give it a number, like that, 34, right, or whatever. this, so if you do it without typing the equals 34, we said that was called declaring the variable. If you whenever you give it an actual value, that's called instantiating the variable. Right? So now we've actually given it a value. So this equal sign is called an assignment operator, and all it does is takes what's on the right and stores it inside what's on the left, essentially. Right? So now that I've declared it up here by using that int keyword, I can change my speed later in code by just typing in speed and then choosing a different value, like say 24. Right? And because I've already declared it up here, it knows that speed actually exists. Right? So it'll know what to do with speed. So I'll just leave speed. The other data type you have to know is what's called a bool or a boolean. And a boolean is just a data type that stores a true or false value. So I'm going to say is right. Right? I'm going to call it is right equals, and then I have to give it a true or false value. So I'm just going to say true for now. And we'll do more with booleans as we get to it. And then you have something called a string, and you give it the same name, or you name it the same way, sorry. And I don't know, one common use for a string is to store your character name or something like that. I'll call my player, I'll just call it after me, like that. Now a string is a little bit different because instead of just typing the value, you have to put it inside quotation marks. So here I've written my name, but I've put it inside quotation marks, right? And the reason for that is that a string is just a whole bunch of characters put together. Cool, because computers don't really understand what characters are, right? They can understand numbers, and they can understand true or false because binary is just a 1 or 0, but they don't really understand what all the characters mean. So we put them in quotation marks, and then we can do things with strings later. We'll get to that. And then you have something called a float. And a float is also a value, like kind of like an integer, but it's usually it is a decimal point number. So instead of int speed equals 34, I don't know, I'll call it float speed 2, right, equals, and instead of 34, I can say 34.1, like that. So, oops. And usually when you use a float, you use this f at the end, and that's just saying that that number is a floating number. So I could just say 34f, and that will recognize that it's 34.0. Right? Oops, up here I have a green underline because name is like a reserved word. So there's some words in programming that already exist, so you can't really use them. So I'll just change it to player name. Okay. So yep. So those are variables. And the other thing you need to know are what's called an access modifier. So as you look through scripts and you look through examples online, you'll see words like private or public right before the variable data type, right? And all that means is if it's private, it will only exist in this class, or, well, all of them only exist in this class, but only this class can access that variable. If you use the word public, then other classes will be able to access it. Right? So here it's public, and one use case specific to Unity is that if it's public, and by the way, it's private by default, right? But if it is public, and I go and run this script, there's my player, and we'll give it a sec to compile. There we go. See how speed has come up here, which means I can change it here on the fly in the inspector, which is really helpful for testing and things like that. Right, so that's what public in Unity allows. That's what public will allow you to do. So there's 21, And so far, this script still does nothing, right? All we've been doing is looking at variables, but variables will be used all throughout our scripting, so it's important to get used to them now. But yeah, just to recap, variables just store some type of information. There's 4 main types that you really need to know. At the beginner stage, one's called the int, which is an integer. One's called a bool, which is a true or false variable. One's called a string, which is just a whole bunch of characters in between 2 quotation marks. And one's called a float, which is a decimal point or a fraction number. And then you have public access specifiers, which will allow, if you use the public one, which will allow other classes to access that variable. And if you use the private one, other classes won't be able to access it. It will only be able to be accessed from within its own class. Okay, that's it for the next video. For this video. In the next video, we'll look at something called an if statement.